Welcome to Renegade Inc, the talk show which allows us to think differently. This week, the team are still on the road at Merthyr Rising, a festival of art, music and ideas here in Merthyr Tydfil in Wales. It's an event with a rich history of questioning the status quo. So, at a time when the establishment and the media have started using fake news as a catch-all phrase about stories that don't fit their agenda, we ask, what is fake news and why has it made such a big splash during these economically unstable times? In terms of trust, the mainstream media today is at an all-time low. Apparently now truth is subjective. So is the term fake news here to stay? And if so, how will it change the future of journalism? Joining me to discuss the new media landscape are the social activist and writer Lindsey German, media analyst Professor Mike Berry, and former British ambassador to Uzbekistan Craig Murray. Welcome to you all, and thanks for coming by. Let's start by let's ask the question to define what is fake news. Mike, start with you.
I should just start first of all. I'm not a professor yet, but thank you very much for the profession. I'm still a doctor at the moment.
Ladies and gentlemen, future Professor Mike Berry.
This is a very difficult question because it's defined differently by different people. So some politicians like Donald Trump would define fake news as anything that is critical of them. At the most obvious level of just false content, just information that's absolutely not, that is not true, that has been made up. Now, there may be different motivations for this. Some people may want to do it in order to direct clicks to sites, in order to generate revenue. Other kind of what we might call fake news might be false information that's put out there for particular kinds of political effects. But there's other areas which have been defined as fake news as well, which are things such as impersonating legitimate sources. So if you go on Twitter, you can find kind of made up accounts which look like real personalities, political figures, but are actually fake accounts. People are going on social networking or on comments pages and posting information which is part of kind of deliberate campaigns or the use of these kind of automated, what are sometimes called bots, which are there to kind of, shape the information environment and lead people often to believe what is actually disinformation or misinformation. So there's actually a very, very wide variety of ways in which fake news can be defined.
Lindsey, when you hear the term fake news, what reaction do you have to it?
If you look at the way the mainstream media put it, it's in terms of people who they regard as somehow not professionals or so on Facebook, doing certain things that might be obviously untrue or might be fake pictures or videos or anything like that. But it seems to me that's firstly a very, very narrow definition of it, and secondly doesn't really bring into the fact that actually we've always had fake news. That if you go back to, the intervention in the elections in the 1920s of the Zinoviev letter, which was an invented letter supposedly from a Russian revolutionary, aimed at stopping Labour from getting elected. This was completely invented and was propagated in the newspapers. There's been dozens and dozens, obviously, of similar things since then. So I think, and of course, when we've had Alistair Campbell and the 45 minutes weapons of mass destruction which could hit British interests, which again was all over the London Evening Standard and was, in my opinion, a completely obvious piece of fake news. I think we have to be very sceptical about the way in which politicians in the establishment just see this as something which other people do. I think particularly since the financial crash of 2008 and the war on terror, there have been, people are rightly quite sceptical of a lot of mainstream media, and also I think mainstream media itself has become much more, I hesitate to use the word dishonest, but perhaps I shouldn't hesitate to use that word, but has become much more slanted, much less decent investigative journalism. So I think all those things have to be thrown into the pot as well when we're looking at it.
With the mainstream media as it's defined, what is happening? Do they feel, Craig, do they feel that they have the truth or they have a sort of monopoly on the truth and the line that they give is ultimately the one that should be believed?
I think what the mainstream media feel is panic. People no longer tend to get their news from a daily newspaper. Far more people are now sourcing their news from the internet. And as a result, the mainstream media are losing their monopoly of defining what is the news. And so this whole panic about fake news as Lindsey said, fake news has always existed. The current panic about fake news is to do with the fact that the monopoly on, if you like, defining the terms of debate is being lost by the mainstream media. The danger of new media is that you have gateways which are corporations. Effectively, Facebook and Twitter have the ability to cut off and close down the stream of most alternative news sources on the internet. Most alternative news sources on the internet, most blogs, get over 50% of their traffic coming in from Facebook or Twitter as sources. So you now have two new large corporations which are gateways, and the whole idea of a fake news meme is to persuade those corporations to close off the gateways and to limit the material to which the public has access. And of course it's true that citizen journalism is as open to abuse as any other journalism, but it's no more open to abuse than any other journalism, and mainstream journalism was always open to abuse too, and abused.
When we look post-2008, the crisis, and we look at the mainstream media in the UK, how would you report on how they have reported that crisis, and what has the effect of that been?
For instance, I looked at the reporting of the banking crisis. Certainly in the press, it tended to be reduced down to a kind of simple morality tale. These are bad bankers, and essentially we just need to kind of cut off their bonuses. But, the system itself is what we're stuck with. This is the capitalist system. The banks have to remain essentially in private ownership. And that's really as far as the kind of discourse in the press went. Interestingly, when we looked at the Today programme, that was very, very much dominated by the banking community. So certainly in the period around the kind of bank bailouts, the overwhelming majority of sources came from kind of the city. So there were things like stockbrokers, hedge fund managers and analysts and city analysts. And these people are not the people who are essentially going to be arguing for stricter reforms, greater control of the shadow banking system, restrictions on the kind of trading of certain kinds of derivative products. But essentially, you also got a lot of argument there on the Today programme about why we didn't need to regulate and why essentially the city was a key part of the economy. But because you had a very restricted range of sources, you tended to get a very, very restrictive debate, particularly in broadcasting, which focused very, very much on the attitudes and the opinions of the people in the city. So the kind of really strong reforms that some people were arguing for in terms of greater regulation, we just didn't find in BBC reporting. And then when you talk to ordinary members of the public, what you find is that a reproduction of that spectrum of opinion.
Because they're parroting what they've already heard, because they think that media is safe and therefore they can replicate those opinions. Media
works by repetition, by the repetition of certain themes and arguments and discourses over a long period of time. And when you looked at the press, over this period from around 2003, 2004, up until the crisis, there were the themes of labour overspending, of employing too many people in the public sector, of people coming here from other countries through asylum or immigration, and then actually defrauding the system. These were repeated again and again and again, hundreds of times a year. A lot of people, in the public don't have a very good understanding of the public spending pot and where different areas go. And when you ask them where the deficit came from, a lot of people would say things like, it came from immigrants coming over here and going on benefits, or it came from, labour overspending. So because the level of public understanding is low, and because people have often been exposed to certain kind of arguments again and again, people often pick up on the things they've heard in the media.
When it comes to public understanding, is it the job of the national broadcaster that's paid for by the people to dispel or debunk economic myths so the people who are paying for it can have a wider range of opinions, so when they go to the voting booth, they're able to put their cross in a box with more information?
Well, of course it should be, but it's very, very different in terms of the way that the BBC operates. And I think that, you see, I would perhaps go further than Mike in this, because it seems to me, for example, if you listen to the Today programme early in the morning from 6 till 7, it's very different from what it's like later on, when it gets much more sort of mainstream political and sort of fluffier things.
How would you define it then between 6 and 7?
Well, it deals much more seriously with certain questions, international questions, foreign policy and so on, which they obviously think are too complicated for people to be able to take on later on. But also is a very big section of business news, which is essentially handed over to business correspondents as opposed to the main correspondents, and it is almost always extremely uncritical of the people that is interviewing. In other words, it's like a sort of puff piece for whichever corporation or whichever banking corporation is doing these things. And I think that, therefore, the whole question of the assumptions of the BBC and of the wider establishment are there. And this is very similar to what you get with questions of war and peace and the military. You see, you're allowed to be opposed to war in certain times. But believe me, the day war starts, as it did in 2003, the whole media narrative changes very, very rapidly. And it's almost like there's been a military coup. It's not like you get a particularly fair hearing beforehand, but afterwards, the whole assumption is you're a problem because you're against this narrative of national unity. These military people all really know what they're talking about. They're the experts. They've got all these ways of looking at things. And I was very reminded of this following the terrible attacks in Manchester. We had Colonel Richard Kemp on the television saying, on a morning breakfast show, saying that Muslims, if they're suspects, should either be interned, locked up without trial, or they should be deported if they're not British citizens. The presenter actually said to him, well, don't you think this is going to cause more trouble than it solves? You know, which is a fairly deep question for some of the questions that you get on some of those programmes. And his response was, oh, I've thought about this rather a long time, as if she hasn't and that nobody else has thought about this thing. And this is somebody who's been wrong so many times. He was head of the army in Afghanistan and repeatedly told us the war was being won and all this kind of thing. And yet they're brought back as somehow they have some kind of expertise which the rest of us don't have. And that is false. It's not fake news, but it's a false assumption, really.
The war you don't see, which is the media narrative, when it comes to foreign policy, what's your view on how news stories are reported and how we are influenced by that, often unconsciously?
If you watch television news, you'll find that frequently they go into newspaper reviews where they bring out an entirely right-wing press and then put up the headlines in the right-wing press and then talk about what the headlines in the right-wing press are. And they'll have two very right-wing people discussing what they think about the headlines in the right-wing media, following which they'll have an announcement about the latest thing which the Labour Party has brought out. And then they'll bring in the Institute of Financial Studies as some independent arbiter, whereas actually, of course, the Institute of Financial Studies is an extremely neoliberal economical institution that gets most of its funding from banks and accountancy firms and other such organisations. And I think that this whole framing of the debate and what's allowed to be discussed and what's not allowed to be discussed is designed to exclude alternative points of view. Now, regularly in opinion polls, you'll find there's a very significant minority of the population who are against nuclear missiles. The only time I've ever seen anybody on the BBC in the last decade, really, be able to forcefully put the argument against nuclear weapons was when Nicola Sturgeon participated in the leadership election debate in 2015. Other than that, that's a view held by almost half the population, which is never allowed to be aired and never allowed to be broadcast. In the current election, it is taken for granted that the potential Prime Minister, who is a massive danger to the future of the world, is the one who would hesitate to blow up the world. And how have we got into this situation? And whenever you see the media frame it, they frame it that way. It is framed that way, as though they are incredulous. They are absolutely incredulous. They are incredulous at the idea that, do you know that if you take the lowest conceivable estimate for the number of children killed in conflict in Iraq after our invasion of Iraq. That's the equivalent of a Manchester bombing every single day for 8 years. And then when somebody dares to suggest that that might result in blowback on us, they are incredible. You can't possibly say that. And yet it is self-evidently true. And that's what the real fake news is. The real fake news is the intellectual refusal to even countenance a view. And the truth that, ordinary people are not stupid. Ordinary people are not stupid. The media live in a bubble of their own. And in that bubble, you're not allowed to admit that wars abroad can cause violence at home. If anyone should admit it, that's a shocking thing to admit. How can you say that? You're encouraging terrorism. The media take as read propositions which are logically indefensible. But it comes back, though, to what you said, that because we had a period where our political parties were entirely captured by one single ideology, that because there was no mainstream political party saying anything sensible, this entirely warped narrative became accepted as the only thing we were allowed to believe and the only thing we were allowed to hear. And that is the real fake news.
And that is a perfect place to leave the first half. Thank you all very much. Welcome back to Renegade Inc, the show that allows us to think differently. We're still on the road here at Merthyr Rising in Wales. Before we talk more with Lindsey German, Mike Berry and Craig Murray about fake news, let's have a quick look at this week's Renegade Inc Index. We start with our favourite tweets. First up is from Tom Pride. Balanced, he says, question mark. This is about the Tory manifesto. May's bid to be tough, not cruel. That's the BBC reporting on the Conservatives. Labour manifesto vision. More spending, more tax, more borrowing. I think Laura Kunsberg wrote that.
It's a shock.
I don't know if you have an opinion on her. Next up is from the Pilius. Simple but effective sign at the Labour manifesto launch states where the real fake news is coming from. Finally, from Man in the Shed, the BBC are so biased the Tories should be forced to declare our TV licences as election expenses. Now, with the sort of proliferation of media, and the amount of views out there, and the mainstream, and the internet, and all the rest of it, does it not lie with us the responsibility to get all views and then make our decision?
If I'm watching news, I will flick, and I'll see what the Russians are saying, and I'll see what the Chinese are saying, and I'll see what the British are saying, and I'll see what others are saying, and I'll try and make a synthesis and work out my idea of where the truth lies. And people obviously graze much more widely on the internet. I think the old-fashioned finance models of newspapers and broadcasters are collapsing. The long-term argument for the license fee becomes smaller and smaller as a decreasing population of people are watching the BBC. I think we're seeing a fundamental change in the way that people who make a living through journalism or make a living through presenting news can do that. And I think we're only at the beginning of that change. I don't think mega news corporations are the future. And I think that's a very good thing.
What do you think are the future?
We're already seeing a situation where people who provide news not through mainstream media are managing to monetize that and make a living doing it. I think in 10, 20 years' time, the media landscape and the way you make a living as a journalist will look very, very different to how it looks now.
How then does a changing media landscape affect the global peace process, if you like?
In Syria, for example, the mainstream media narrative about the white helmets into which a huge amount of effort has been put in presenting this rather fake group as heroic human rights and humanitarian defenders, has been almost totally undermined by alternative narratives coming out, particularly from within Syria, by bloggers and citizen journalists there telling us what really is happening. I think the ability of the establishment, if I can use that term, to present and sell a false media is nowadays being fatally undermined by the ability, by people's possession of, almost everyone has a video camera in their pocket nowadays. And they have the ability to post and get their views out on the net. If the Iraq war were to happen now, we would see far more dead and mutilated children than we were allowed to see then, because citizen journalism would get the images out there. The ability of governments to present false narratives is being fatally undermined. I think that's a development which is very positive.
Where would you place the spin doctor Alistair Campbell in... no, not literally.
I think in the seventh circle of hell.
I was going to
Ask a stupid question. Where would you place him in the historical narrative?
The ability to control and cajole the mainstream media was a vital role for governments. It's becoming harder for them to do. If the mainstream media had anything like the power they used to, then Jeremy Corbyn would now be in a situation which would be completely hopeless. And he's not in a situation which is completely hopeless.
I agree with a lot of what Craig says, but I think this is still a situation where it's still very much unbalanced in terms of whatever the weaknesses of the mainstream media. They still have massively more resources. I think what's interesting is that, for example, I think particularly with photographs and films, if you think about the Black Lives Matter thing in the United States, a lot of those cases have been brought to attention because policemen in America have been killing people for a long, long time and will continue to do so. But this time there is actually much more evidence that you can say, OK, this person was putting their hands up or whatever. And so I think those things can have a very big direct political impact. But I think it's still an unequal fight. And I think the situation with Jeremy Corbyn is an astonishing situation, really, that we have had now 2 years where they've told us repeatedly he wasn't electable, he wasn't electable, he wasn't electable. And actually, at the beginning of this election campaign, I remember Nick Robinson on the Today programme sneering, and I think it was John McDonnell who was saying the more that people see Jeremy Corbyn, the better his ratings will become because he says what he thinks and he's honest and so on. And, he just sneered and said, oh, are you really saying that? Well, that looks like it's what's happening, but it is despite the whole still of the mainstream media. And one of the things I find worse is this kind of fake populist mainstream media where they go and say, oh, we're going to ask people on the street. So where do they go? They go to a market where, they find some stall holder who, I don't want to go on about, there's plenty of very good market stall holders, but it's also, they're quite often people with quite reactionary points of view. What do you think of Jeremy Corbyn? No, really tell us how bad you think he is. Then they find somebody else who says, I've always voted Labour, but I'm never going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I'm not saying there aren't these people, but it seems to me this is incredibly slanted way of doing it. So I think all of these things, and because it's dressed up as this is what the ordinary person in the street in Merthyr or wherever it is says, it's given some validity. It's got no validity at all. It's got absolutely none. So I think we have to be very aware that this is going on.
Your solutions, Mike?
So actually, I profoundly disagree with you, Craig. I actually think we actually need to strengthen the BBC, but we have to also at the same time insist the BBC lives up to its own charter obligations to represent all strands of opinion. I think we need to. We need to properly finance and we need to strengthen good quality, investigative, factual journalism. I think that is what we really need to concentrate on. And I think the idea of us ending up kind of like the United States, where one half of the country watches one news network, another seems to live in a completely different world and watches another, and this is all amplified through the kind of echo chambers that people live in on social media, I think that is profoundly dangerous.
It's good we disagree, we can have a row. I don't think you would invent the BBC now. I've never seen a state broadcaster anywhere in the world that wasn't basically a government propaganda organisation, and the BBC is no different. And I don't like government propaganda organisations. Nowadays, broadcasting is very different. The platform is less important now than the content. And the idea that you need a national platform, I think, is perhaps an idea whose time has gone.
Lindsey.
The argument for the BBC is obviously this idea of public service broadcasting, which is meant to be over and above doing something which is positive. And, to be perfectly honest, there's lots of very, very good things that are produced by the BBC. I mean, I tend to agree with Craig. I'm not saying I agree with all his conclusions on this. I do think, however, that one of the reasons that we're having this kind of discussion is that the BBC's news agenda has become much, much worse and much, much more obviously biased in all sorts of ways. And I think that therefore is a very difficult problem, because how do you change that? Mike says, well, we've got to fight to kind of change it, but how do you change it when the whole assumption... I mean, you look at who actually... I'm sorry to keep going on about this Today programme, but it's a particular... I've got to stop listening to it, really, because it doesn't do my blood pressure any good at all. But, when you look, I mean, one of the presenters is married to a baronet, another was a former chair of the Tory, the Conservative Society at university, and John Humphreys is just a sort of bad-tempered, gruff old bigot that, you'll come across in a number of pubs. And I do think these people are in an absolute bubble. Now, I don't know, I don't think there's an easy solution to this, but I do think we have to avoid the idea that somehow the BBC is a cut above in terms of its news broadcast, certainly, because I really don't think that's true. And I really think that the BBC political correspondents are very, very partial in terms of the way, we saw the quote from Laura Kunsberg. You can see this kind of thing on a daily basis from her, and she's not the only one.
Journalists work within certain kinds of constraints in terms of what can be said, and there's areas of openness on closure on different issues. But I think it's just factually incorrect to say that it's just a government propaganda arm. It's much, much more complicated than that.
That's it from Renegade Inc. this week here at Merthyr Rising. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us @Renegade Inc. Join us next week for more people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.